The door of the store opened, bringing in a cold breeze, and a stranger stepped in. No one noticed him, no one greeted him. He was just a silent figure, walking with his hands deep in his coat pockets, his cap pulled low, hiding most of his face. In stark contrast to the bustling and cheerful atmosphere the store used to have, the air now felt suffocating and empty, as if all life had vanished. But his name, John Reed, appeared on the large sign hanging on every hallway, on every shelf in the store. He was the one who had built this chain of stores from the very beginning, with a strong belief that kindness would be the great driving force for development. But today he was not the powerful owner he once was. He no longer saw smiles, no longer felt excitement. Instead, there was a pervasive coldness. The shelves stood quietly, some were empty, promotional signs hung crookedly, full of dust. The whole store seemed to be gasping for air, devoid of life. John walked among the rows of shelves, looking at each detail in the store, the details he had once carefully tended, supervised, and created. At this moment, he could only feel one thing: failure. This feeling was like a heavy stone pressing down on his chest, making it hard for him to breathe. This was no longer a store. This was a betrayal. It was not what he had built, but a shadow of the past. He stood still for a while, looking around and feeling a deep sadness. This store was no longer the warm place he had once hoped for. It had become a lifeless place where the people working here had no joy or motivation. His feelings at that moment were not those of an owner watching over his creation, but of a stranger who no longer had a place to call home. John continued walking through the empty aisles, the faint light from the ceiling lamps casting long shadows on the floor. The feeling of emptiness and coldness pervaded the space. The smell of freshly baked bread that he had once smelled every morning was now gone. Instead, there was the scent of dust and the silence of time passing. The bright days of the past had now faded into distant memories. He paused for a moment in front of the cashier counter, where he saw Emily Carter, an old employee of the store. She was working with trembling hands, her gaze vacant, the signs of a long, exhausting night clearly visible on her face. Though tired, she still smiled. But it was a forced smile, unable to hide the exhaustion and worry in her eyes. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice fragile as if it could barely escape her throat, like a greeting that no longer held any meaning. John could feel the silence enveloping them. There was no response, no friendly words exchanged. Only customers rushing by, no one stopping, no one daring to look her in the eyes. The entire space seemed to stand still, lifeless. Emily tried to continue her work, but perhaps even her efforts had been drained. Every barcode scan, every count of money felt like a challenge. She forced herself to smile, but those lips could not bring joy. It was just an empty smile, without meaning. John stood silently from a distance watching. He could no longer remain just an outsider, watching everything happen without intervening. The pain in his heart became even more evident. This was the place he had dedicated himself to building, but now it had become a lifeless shell. The suffocating atmosphere was not just the absence of voices and smiles, but the absence of trust. A loud sound cut through the silence from the front counter. Victor Stone, the store supervisor, walked in, holding a clipboard. His gaze was arrogant and cold, like a gust of cold wind blowing through the room, dispelling any warmth. Victor did not need to greet anyone or introduce himself. He simply gave orders, cutting off the silence and creating a tension that no one dared to challenge. "Lane 4, he barked, startling Emily. Her eyes quickly dropped, trying to keep calm, despite her hands trembling from fatigue. Victor's cold gaze seemed to pierce through any resilience she tried to muster. John stood silently from afar, feeling each of Victor's orders like a knife cutting into his flesh. He saw the humiliation in Emily's eyes, the withering of her smile, and that was when he realized one thing. This place was no longer the home of dreams, but had turned into a prison where everyone had to endure silence and pain. He turned away, but the pain wouldn't leave. Those looks, those sighs haunted him. How could he let this continue? John continued walking, his footsteps heavy as if they could not leave the ground. Each step felt like a burden pressing down on his shoulders. The feeling that this place was no longer a store, But a prison, with people being ostracized, held back by an invisible fear, was overwhelming. They no longer had freedom, no joy in their work, only silence, waiting for commands from those who couldn't understand the pain they were enduring. He turned to look at Emily, the woman standing there, her hands trembling as she held the receipt, her hollow eyes staring at the computer screen. She tried to smile, but that smile was just a thin facade. She had learned to pretend that she was fine, that she could push through, but John knew deep inside she was breaking. Her red-rimmed eyes could not hide the exhaustion and pressure weighing on her heart. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the air. Victor came in again, not to give orders this time, but to criticize. Emily saw him and didn't dare look up. She simply lowered her head, too afraid to meet his gaze. The entire space seemed to freeze. Only the sound of heavy breathing from the other employees filled the silence. "What is it this time?" Victor asked, his voice harsh, filled with contempt. Emily remained silent, not responding. She just kept her head down, her hands still shaking as she scanned the items. A long silence passed, making the tension in the air even more unbearable. It was as if everyone knew this was a fight they could never win. John couldn't bear it any longer. He couldn't just stand by and watch these people suffer. He looked toward Victor, his gaze no longer filled with patience. It wasn't anger, but disappointment. Disappointment in a system that had been built on trust and respect, but now had turned into a machine that devoured people's dreams and hopes. John walked over to the counter where Emily stood, still trying to do her job despite her body nearing exhaustion. He stopped in front of her, but he didn't say a word. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and in that brief moment, she realized that something had changed. He placed his hand on her shoulder silently, but that gesture alone was enough for her to feel the comfort and understanding that she had not received in all this time. Emily looked at him, her eyes starting to shine a little, as if a small light had just flickered in the darkness. The guilt inside her was impossible to hide, but John's gaze made her feel accepted, even though everything around her was falling apart. The space was still silent, but now it was the silence of determination. John had made up his mind. He could no longer stay on the sidelines. It was time to take action, time to start over. John could no longer bear it for another minute. He turned to Victor, his gaze cold but full of resolve. Victor, the man who had always used control and fear to dominate, was no longer the person he had once known. It wasn't just the cruelty in his treatment of the employees, but the lack of respect for the very work they did every day. John walked toward Victor, saying nothing. But with every step he took, it was a statement that couldn't be ignored. Everyone in the store, from the employees to the customers, could feel the shift in the air. Victor still didn't realize he was being seen through. He tried to maintain his facade of power, but under John's sharp gaze, it all seemed meaningless. "Victor," John spoke, his voice soft yet commanding. "It's time to say goodbye." Victor froze, his eyes wide in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. He stammered, "What? What are you talking about? You can't do this." "Yara," but John didn't give him a chance to react further. "Can't doesn't mean impossible," John replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "Victor, I can't let this tyranny and cruelty continue. You've destroyed what we built." Victor took a step back, not out of fear, but out of shock. He had never imagined that John, the founder of the company, the one he had considered a stranger after all these years, would stand up like this. But now the truth was clear. John was the founder and the only one with the real power to decide the fate of the store. John turned to the employees who were watching him, not daring to breathe too loudly in fear of drawing attention. But John knew they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He took a deep breath, then addressed them. "I know all of you have been enduring difficult times here, but I want you to understand that this is not the company I wanted to create. We can't continue living in fear. From today, we will change." The whole store seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The employees started to lift their heads, no longer bowing their heads or avoiding eye contact. They could feel the change in the air. A new sense of hope began to spread. Emily was nearby, her hands still shaking, but her eyes now shone brighter, no longer filled with exhaustion and sorrow. John looked at her and smiled softly. He knew that change had to start with small steps, with specific actions. "Emily," he said gently, "from now on, I want you to be the shift supervisor. You're the one who has the strength and courage to help us start over." Emily stood in shock, unable to believe what she was hearing. She had worked at this store for so long, always trying to keep things steady even though she was exhausted. But never once did she think she'd have the chance to lead. But now John didn't just trust her, he was giving her the opportunity to prove herself. "Thank you, John," she said, her voice soft but full of determination. "I won't let you down." John nodded, then turned back to the rest of the employees in the store. "From now on, we will rebuild together, starting with respect for each other, with a focus on the core values we once believed in." The store was silent, but this time it was a silence of agreement. People began to regain their trust in the company, in themselves, and in John. Victor stood there, his hands clenched tightly around the clipboard. He couldn't say anything more. John had made his decision, and his decision could not be changed by someone like Victor. John turned back, looking at the empty shelves, the marks of neglect and failure. But he didn't feel despair. He knew that as long as they walked in the right direction, this store could recover. "We'll start over," he whispered to himself, "and this time, we'll do it right." Everyone began to return to their work, no longer afraid, no longer burdened. The employees felt the shift in the atmosphere, and they knew that respect and trust would be the values they would uphold and nurture from now on. John walked out down the hallway of the store, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He knew this journey had just begun, but he also knew that with the first solid steps taken, the future belonged to those who worked with integrity and passion. The following day, the atmosphere in the store began to change noticeably. The employees worked with more enthusiasm, no longer with the fearful or reluctant looks that had been present before. The shelves were rearranged and products were displayed more carefully. Emily, now the new shift supervisor, began running the shifts smoothly and efficiently. She not only assisted the staff but also inspired them, reigniting their belief in the company. John observed everything from a distance, watching the gradual transformation. He didn't need to shout orders or make strong commands. His presence, along with his promise of change, had created an invisible force that drove everyone to work harder and more diligently. However, the biggest challenge still lay ahead. After a few days, Victor couldn't sit still anymore. John's decisions had reduced his control, and this made Victor increasingly uncomfortable. He wasn't one to accept defeat easily, and after all, he had still been an important part of the system, at least until John came. Victor sought out John during a break. They sat across from each other, the silence between them like a sharp knife cutting through the room. Victor spoke first. "I think you've gone too far," Victor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can't change everything overnight." John looked at him, his eyes sharp but calm. "I don't need to change everything immediately, but what I'm doing is necessary. The people here deserve an environment that's respectful and fair." Victor chuckled mockingly, but his laughter held a hint of frustration and fear. Who will work without pressure? Who will stand firm without rules and discipline? Everything can't just be based on trust and respect. "No, Victor," John replied, his voice measured but firm. "Things can't be built on fear. That's not how I want this company to operate." Victor fell silent, unable to come up with a response. He realized that John had decided on his path, regardless of what he might say. But deep inside, a plan began to form in Victor's mind. He couldn't let everything slip away like this, and he knew that no matter what, he wouldn't give up easily. Meanwhile, as Victor quietly prepared for his own confrontation, John continued his work, focusing on rebuilding trust and respect within the company. He began attending department meetings, listening to the opinions of employees, and directly guiding important changes. He encouraged every employee to have a voice and began transforming the work environment from the smallest details. This change was not an easy process. The employees were still a little hesitant, but with each small action from John, they started to feel their value. Emily worked with confidence but also with care. She started organizing meetings to encourage employees to share their thoughts and concerns. Each conversation brought a small but sure change in how employees treated each other and the customers. A month later, John's store began to show positive signs. Though there were still many challenges ahead, the changes were beginning to be felt clearly. Customers entering the store could feel the difference in the atmosphere. Real smiles, no longer just forced ones, started appearing on the faces of the employees. John stood in the store once again, seeing things gradually stabilize. He felt a sense of pride, but more than that, he felt a belief in the path he had chosen. He knew that although the battle wasn't over, he had taken the crucial first steps. And at this moment, John realized more clearly than ever that it wasn't power or authority that made the difference, but respect and compassion. Those were the things that made the greatest difference in both work and life. As time passed, the changes at Fresh Mart became more evident. The store was no longer the gloomy, lifeless place it once was. The employees worked together more harmoniously, and respect for one another grew stronger. Customers walked in and immediately felt the warm, welcoming atmosphere they had not experienced in a long time at a retail store. Everything was slowly returning to the path John had set for it. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Victor was still quietly watching every move John made, refusing to accept these changes. His pride and the power he had held for so long were not easily let go. Moreover, John's changes had exposed the flaws in Victor's management, something he could not accept. One morning, Victor stood in front of John's office door. No longer with the same confidence and arrogance he had before, his face was now filled with anger and frustration. Despite the emotions boiling within him, his pride as a man who had lost his power remained intact. Victor decided to face John to settle their growing disagreements. "You've changed everything without consulting me," Victor started, his voice uncertain. No longer the confident tone it used to be. "Everything can't just be based on trust and kindness. This is a company, not a charity." John looked up at him, not rushing, not flustered. He had known this moment would come, and he was ready for it. "I'm not trying to create a charity, Victor. I just want to rebuild trust, honesty, and kindness in this company. Those aren't secondary factors. They are the core foundation for a business to thrive." Victor looked straight into John's eyes, his face filled with contempt. "Then you're destroying this company. Everything was running fine under my leadership, and you're making a mess just because of some unrealistic ideals." John took a deep breath and calmly responded, "My ideals are not theories, Victor. They are what I've built from the beginning. But I've come to realize that, while I want everyone to work with passion and respect, you've been using fear to control them." Feeling threatened, Victor stepped closer, no longer able to hold his patience. "If you want to change, be prepared to face the consequences. These employees, the people you think can change everything, they'll never accept your strange ways." John didn't change his expression, but inside he knew that this was his most important challenge. "I've seen these employees dedicate themselves to the company, to the respect we've built. They don't need a leader like you. They need someone who will bring them back to the core values, not someone who controls them through fear." Victor was silent, and there were no more words he could say. He realized that John had made his decision, and his decision could not be changed by someone like Victor. John turned to the employees who were still watching him, trying not to make any noise for fear of attracting attention. But John knew they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He took a deep breath and addressed them. "I know all of you have been enduring difficult times here, but I want you to understand that this is not the company I wanted to create. We can't continue living in fear. From today, we will change." The whole store seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The employees started to lift their heads, no longer bowing or avoiding eye contact. They could feel the change in the air. A new sense of hope began to spread. Emily, standing nearby, her hands still shaking, but her eyes now shining, felt a shift. She could feel the transformation, not just from the words of John, but from deep within herself. She had regained her confidence, no longer having to pretend to be okay, but standing firm in her role as the new shift supervisor. Victor stood there, his hands tightly clutching the clipboard. He couldn't say anything more. John had made his decision, and there was nothing more he could do to stop it. John turned his attention back to the store, knowing that although the changes had just begun, the foundation had been laid. Now it was time to rebuild. The days following the confrontation with Victor brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at Fresh Mart. Though old wounds had not yet healed, the change from within was slowly seeping into every corner of the store. The employees worked with greater enthusiasm, no longer burdened by the fear or pressure that Victor had imposed. Conversations between staff became more frequent, sometimes small chats, simple greetings, but they created a completely different atmosphere compared to before. John didn't just watch the change from afar. He began to take part in the daily work, sharing the burdens with the employees, no longer keeping the distance he once had. He worked alongside them, listened to them more than ever before. He was no longer just the boss sitting in his office, but a true leader who walked the walk with his team. One morning, Emily, an employee who had been with the store for many years, paused for a moment after realizing the change. Though she didn't speak, her eyes brightened as if a small flame had been reignited within her. She no longer had to look up at Victor whenever he passed by, no longer felt like she was being watched or harshly judged. John noticed that change. He smiled when he saw Emily engaging in conversation with customers, no longer showing the anxiety or exhaustion in her voice. He knew that this transformation didn't come just from his words, but from the change within Emily herself. She had regained her confidence, not just because she had a job, but because she felt valued. Later that day, Marcus pushed a cart full of goods through the store, and when he saw John from a distance, they exchanged a glance. No words were needed, but Marcus knew that he no longer had to endure the gloomy days, the sleepless nights spent working hard without recognition. He could clearly feel that the change in the store wasn't just John's doing, it was their doing. They were the ones who had changed from within. That evening after work, Linda stood by the window smiling. She no longer saw darkness in her work. She had truly come to understand that what she did wasn't just to make a living, but to create real value for those around her. The smiles and thank yous she received from customers were no longer just casual remarks. Each one of those words carried weight. John stood in the corner of the store, observing the employees as they worked. He felt a swell of pride within him. The store was no longer just a place for people to earn money. It had become a place where they could rediscover their belief in their work and the values they stood for. They no longer worked just to complete a task. They worked because they believed in what they were doing. For John, this work was never just about keeping a business running. It was about creating an environment where everyone could grow, be respected, and find meaning in the work they did every day. He hadn't just rebuilt the store, he had rebuilt the trust within every person who worked there. This change didn't come from big decisions. It came from small actions every day. He didn't need to do anything grandiose. He just needed to listen, encourage, and lead by example. And from there, those values began to permeate every corner of the store. One morning, John stood by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight of the new day. He exhaled softly, not because of worry, but because of the peace in his heart. He knew that the journey ahead would still be long, but at least he had found the right path. And that path didn't just belong to him, it belonged to everyone who had walked alongside him in this journey. One morning, the atmosphere in Fresh Mart was still calm, unhurried. The employees began their work at a steady pace, but now there was a clear difference. No longer were there weary or hesitant glances exchanged between them. They looked at each other with pride. John entered the store, and this time, no one had to face him as a stranger. Emily, now the assistant manager, greeted customers at the door with a bright smile. She was no longer the tired cashier, but the one who inspired her colleagues. Her new team had learned to appreciate the value of their work, and more importantly, they knew how to convey that respect to the customers. Customers walked in and immediately felt the difference. They weren't just welcomed warmly, but they truly felt respected. The employees in the store no longer appeared indifferent or exhausted. They worked not because they had to, but because they loved what they were doing. The sense that their work had meaning made everyone operate with a higher spirit, filled with positive energy. Marcus no longer had to endure long, grueling hours without recognition. He began to take on more responsibilities, and everyone in the store saw this change. He was no longer a passive worker, he had become a small leader, guiding the newer employees. One morning, John decided to visit the store during peak hours, when the customers were busiest. He quietly walked through the aisles, observing each employee. What made him the proudest was seeing their initiative. They greeted customers, handled requests, and, most importantly, they did all of this with enthusiasm, not just to complete the task at hand, but to create a good experience for those who walked in. Victor, who had once brought fear and contempt to everyone, was no longer part of the store. John hadn't just removed him from his position, He had sent a strong message. Everyone could now see the difference between a true leader and someone who only knew how to wield power to suppress others. As John walked through the store, he saw employees who were no longer lifeless figures, but real people. They smiled at customers, they offered their warmth, and they gave back the trust that had been lost. The shelves were arranged neatly, shining brightly, just like the trust they placed in their work. Fresh Mart was no longer a cold, lifeless store. It had become a place where people came not just to shop, but to experience the warmth of human connection. The greetings, the friendly smiles, and the sincere glances were no longer rare. They had become an essential part of the store's culture. John stood in his office, looking out the window. His heart felt light as he looked out at the store. He didn't see piles of reports or dry numbers on paper. He saw people living authentically in their work. They were respected and felt loved. John knew that this journey was just beginning. He could feel the change in the atmosphere, but there were still many challenges ahead. But with the trust that had been rebuilt, he knew nothing could stop them. His store was no longer just a business, it had become a community, and that was the most important thing. That day when the store closed and the employees left for the night, John stood alone. He turned around to look at the shining shelves, the empty cash registers. But unlike before, today he felt that this space wasn't just a lifeless store. It was a place full of life and hope for the future. And John walked out the door, head held high. Not because of financial success, but because he had brought a new spirit to Fresh Mart, a spirit based on respect and trust in people. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had already proven everything. The following morning, John stood in his office, holding a cup of hot coffee. He looked over the documents on his desk, the monthly reports, the new projects, but there was no sense of pressure or tension like before. Instead, he felt a quiet pride within him, a sense of reassurance that the changes, though small, had begun to have a significant impact. Things hadn't become perfect overnight, but Fresh Mart was returning to the core values he had established when he first founded the company. He knew he couldn't change everything all at once, but at least he had given his employees a renewed sense of trust and a new vision for their work and themselves. Those who had once suffered in silence, those who had once been exhausted, could now stand tall, straightened, and speak their minds. Emily, now more than just a tired cashier, had become an assistant manager, responsible and empowered. When John saw her standing tall, guiding the new employees, he knew that she had overcome her fear and was confident in herself. She wasn't just working for a paycheck anymore. She was working because she believed in the values that Fresh Mart upheld. And that was the value John had always sought. One morning, as Marcus pushed a cart full of goods, he saw John from a distance. They exchanged a look. No words were necessary. But Marcus knew that he no longer had to endure the dark days or the sleepless nights spent working without recognition. He could clearly feel that the change in the store wasn't just due to John, but because of them, the people who had changed from within. Victor, the man who had once instilled fear and contempt in everyone, was no longer a part of the store. John hadn't just removed him from his position, he had sent a powerful message. Everyone could now see the difference between a true leader and a person who used power to oppress others. When John walked through the store, he no longer saw employees as hollow figures, but as real people. They greeted customers, they offered warmth, and they gave back the trust that had once been lost. The shelves were neatly arranged, sparkling bright, just like the trust they had placed in their work. Fresh Mart was no longer a cold, lifeless store. It had become a place where people came not just to shop, but to feel the warmth of human connection. The greetings, the friendly smiles, the sincere glances were no longer rare. They had become an essential part of the store's culture. John stood in his office, looking out the window. His heart felt light as he gazed upon the store. He no longer saw piles of reports or dry numbers. He saw people truly living in their work, people who were respected and felt loved. John knew that this journey was just beginning. He could feel the change in the atmosphere, but there were still many challenges ahead. But with the trust that had been rebuilt, he knew nothing could stop them. The store was no longer just a business. It had become a community. And that was the most important thing. That day when the store closed and the employees went home, John remained alone. He turned to look at the sparkling shelves, the empty cash registers. But unlike before today, he felt that this space wasn't just a lifeless store. It was a place full of life, full of hope for the future. And John walked out the door, head held high, not because of financial success, but because he had brought a new spirit to Fresh Mart, a spirit based on respect and trust in people. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had already proven everything. The next morning, Fresh Mart opened its doors as usual, but the atmosphere inside had changed. As the employees began their work, they no longer exchanged weary or hesitant glances. They looked at each other with pride. John entered the store, and this time no one had to face him as a stranger. Emily, now the assistant manager, greeted customers at the door with a bright smile. She was no longer the tired cashier, but the one who inspired her colleagues. Her new team had learned to appreciate the value of their work, and more importantly, they knew how to convey that respect to the customers. Customers walked in and immediately felt the difference. They weren't just welcomed warmly, but they truly felt respected. The employees in the store no longer appeared indifferent or exhausted. They worked not because they had to, but because they loved what they were doing. The sense that their work had meaning made everyone operate with higher spirits, filled with positive energy. Marcus no longer had to endure long, grueling hours without recognition. He began to take on more responsibilities, and everyone in the store saw this change. He was no longer a passive worker. He had become a small leader, guiding the newer employees. One morning, John decided to visit the store during peak hours, when customers were busiest. He quietly walked through the aisles, observing each employee. What made him the proudest was seeing their initiative. They greeted customers, handled requests, and most importantly, they did all of this with enthusiasm, not just to complete the task at hand, but to create a good experience for those who walked in. Victor, who had once instilled fear and contempt in everyone, was no longer part of the store. John hadn't just removed him from his position, he had sent a strong message. Everyone could now see the difference between a true leader and someone who only knew how to wield power to suppress others. As John walked through the store, he saw employees who were no longer lifeless figures, but real people. They smiled at customers, offered their warmth, and gave back the trust that had been lost. The shelves were neatly arranged, shining brightly, just like the trust they placed in their work. Fresh Mart was no longer a cold, lifeless store. It had become a place where people came not just to shop, but to experience the warmth of human connection. The greetings, the friendly smiles, and the sincere glances were no longer rare. They had become an essential part of the store's culture. John stood in his office looking out the window. His heart felt light as he looked out at the store. He didn't see piles of reports or dry numbers on paper. He saw people living authentically in their work. They were respected and felt loved. John knew that this journey was just beginning. He could feel the change in the atmosphere, but there were still many challenges ahead. But with the trust that had been rebuilt, he knew nothing could stop them. His store was no longer just a business, it had become a community, and that was the most important thing. That day when the store closed and the employees left for the night, John stood alone. He turned around to look at the shining shelves, the empty cash registers. But unlike before, today he felt that this space wasn't just a lifeless store. It was a place full of life and hope for the future. And John walked out the door head held high, not because of financial success, but because he had brought a new spirit to Fresh Mart, a spirit based on respect and trust in people. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had already proven everything. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.